Gaudete, gaudete, Christus es natus, ex Maria Virgine gaudete.
Welcome to the Rediscovery channel. This is a channel where I, Ivor Kovac, and my good friend Stilgar take turns coming up with topics from history that the other person doesn't know about and often hasn't heard about. And today it is my turn, and we're also joined by a guest. His channel is called A New Resolve. So throughout the course of this video, I'll just call him New Resolve or Resolve. But today's topic is Moses. So I'm going to ask you guys, have you ever, how much thought have you given to when Moses lived in history and who the Pharaoh might have been and what his role in Egypt was before he got kicked out?
Wow.
Yeah, can't honestly, probably zero, I would say, close, very little.
Yeah, me too as well. I mean, I've imagined what it was like, but I honestly haven't given it really any thought as far as those specifics.
So I've been wondering for a good while on where Moses and the Exodus fall into the history of Egypt and who are those pharaohs. And I believe that I've figured it out, as well as the time period when the Israelites were enslaved, when they left, when the plagues of Egypt occurred. Of course, we did a video previously about the Ipuwer Papyrus, which is an Egyptian document from the 13th Dynasty that describes the plagues of Egypt from their perspective. So that video is up if anybody wants to go back and see. But anyways, let's go ahead and get into it. So I believe that Moses was born during the 12th Dynasty, and the plagues struck Egypt during the 13th Dynasty. And I also believe that the plagues and the devastation that they caused are what ultimately caused the Second Intermediate Period. And the Second Intermediate Period is a time when a group of invaders came and took over Egypt. They were called the Hyksos, and they came out of the Middle East. So the Middle Kingdom period, it's just the 12th and 13th dynasties. The 12th dynasty was around for about 200 years, give or take. And the 13th dynasty was short-lived. And it was basically a crash and burn type of period. So like I mentioned the Ipuwer Papyrus before, and what I'll do is, as I'm talking about this right now, I'll put some parallels in the slideshow of quotations from the Ipuwer text and Exodus showing where one attests to the other, basically. So I see the Ipuwer Papyrus as a hard end for how late the Exodus can be and the plagues of Egypt. So this document is dated to the 13th dynasty, and it's not dated based on any unreliable or subjective methods like carbon dating or any other radiometric dating, anything like that. It's dated because it's dated by the text, because the Egyptian language is very old. It's been around for thousands of years. So we can generally tell what dynasty it corresponds to based on the type of writing that's used and the style. So, of course, the last stage of the Egyptian language is the Coptic language, which after that it became, for the most part, a dead language. But, of course, it's still used in church liturgy. So we can tell, I think before that it was the hieratic. And then originally, of course, it was a system of hieroglyphs. So it was a constant change relatively. So you can tell based on the writing when it was written. So this was written during the 13th dynasty. And it talks about the river having been turned to blood and dead being in every household, and the animals are moaning and the dead bodies are piling up. The plants are stripped bare. All this kind of stuff. So, and anybody that wants...
Sorry, this was mentioned in this document? In this?
Yeah, it's in the Ipuwer Papyrus.
Wow.
Yeah. Just about every single one of the plagues of Egypt, as well as the aftermath, where it talks about how the Israelites looted the Egyptians. They pillaged them on their way out, and took clothes and jewelry and stuff. So that's another thing that's in the Ipuwer Papyrus. It talks about the women have nothing nice to wear because the servants have taken, like, they have no clothes, they have no jewelry, and you find the servants and the slaves are wearing the nice things. So it is there, and it's dated to the 13th dynasty reliably. So we can view this as the hard end for when the plagues of Egypt and the Exodus occurred. And it's also corroboration, right? It's a source outside of the Bible, from people who are a different religion. And you could say it's a hostile source also that attests to the same event. So again, like, I'll put a link below for this one if anybody wants to read the whole papyrus, but we also did a video about this earlier. So now what I want to do is, bearing in mind that this is a hard end to how late these events can be, I want to start building my case for when the Israelites were enslaved, and we'll lead up to who was Moses. So what I'm going to do now is read a little bit from Josephus, the Antiquities of the Jews, Volume 1 by Flavius Josephus. And what I want you guys to do is, Stilgar, I want you to look up Exodus chapter 1, and Resolve, I want you to look up Exodus chapter 5, and just be ready.
Okay.
All right, so this comes from the Antiquities of Jews, written by Josephus. And the title here is Concerning the Afflictions That Befell the Hebrews in Egypt During the 400 Years. I guess I should ask, do you guys know who Josephus is?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. For our viewers, he's a Jewish historian. He wrote the Antiquities of the Jews, as well as the Jewish Wars, or I think it's called the War of the Jews, which I haven't started reading yet. But the history was, he wrote the histories of the Jewish people for the benefit of people who aren't Jewish. So like his Roman friends that he collaborated with.
If anyone's
course,
interested, sorry. If anyone's interested, of course, you can find it on Amazon, but I've actually seen the complete works of Josephus at Barnes & Noble. So if anyone's in Barnes & Noble, you can look around, you probably see them there too.
Yeah, I ordered mine, I think, from Barnes & Noble online, actually. But here we go. Now it happened that the Egyptians grew delicate and lazy as to painstaking, and gave themselves up to other pleasures, and in particular to the love of gain. They also became very ill affected towards the Hebrews, as touched with envy at their prosperity. For when they saw how the nation of the Israelites flourished, and were become eminent already in plenty of wealth, which they had acquired by their virtue and natural love of labor, they thought their increase was to their own detriment, and having in length of time forgotten the benefits that they had received from Joseph, particularly the crown being now come into another family, they became very abusive to the Israelites, and contrived many ways of afflicting them. For they enjoined them to cut a great number of channels for the river, and to build walls for their cities and ramparts, that they might restrain the river and hinder its waters from stagnating. Upon its running over its own banks, they set them also to build pyramids, and by all this wore them out, and forced them to learn all sorts of mechanical arts, and to accustom themselves to hard labor. And 400 years did they spend under these afflictions, for they strove one against the other, which should get the mastery, the Egyptians desiring to destroy the Israelites by these labors, and the Israelites desiring to hold out to the end under them. Stilgar, go ahead, if you could, and read Exodus chapter 1, verses 13 through 14.
And work them ruthlessly. 13 and 14, you said?
13 and 14.
Okay. And work them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar, and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly.
Okay. And resolve, or new resolve, read Exodus 5:6-8.
Okay. And Pharaoh commanded the same day the taskmasters of the people and their officers, saying, You shall no more give the people straw to make brick, as heretofore. Let them go and gather straw for themselves. And the tale of the bricks which they did make heretofore, ye shall lay upon them. Ye shall not diminish aught thereof, for they be idle. Therefore they cry, saying, Let us go and sacrifice to our God.
Okay, so guys, the main takeaways here is that they're building irrigation and pyramids, right? And pyramids are important because this is going to narrow it down for us when this occurred. But also, what are they making the everything out of? Bricks, right? Made with straw. So the criterion here are as follows. So we're looking for a time when pyramids are being built, and we need pyramids that are built with bricks and straw. Okay, so the pyramid building periods of Egyptian history is the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. Now, during the Old Kingdom, they didn't make the pyramids out of bricks; they made them out of stone. And the actual technology and the way in which they were constructed is unknown to this day. There's all kinds of speculation. You got people saying all kinds of things. Like there's some crazy theories now that like aliens were involved or something like that, which I don't believe. But whatever methods they used to build those old pyramids out of stone were lost. And the Old Kingdom pyramids are actually the best preserved. If you go to Egypt today, Middle Kingdom pyramids, a lot of them, they just look like mounds of dirt because they were built with bricks made with straw, and they're coming apart. So this puts us, you know, if we can believe Josephus, and of course we're all Christians here, so we're going to believe the Bible. This puts us in the ballpark of the Middle Kingdom period for when this labor is going on. So I would say 12th Dynasty is probably when the Israelites were enslaved. Has to be, based on this criterion here. So the next question is there evidence of slavery during this time? Because, of course, you see lots of people saying that, oh, the pyramids were not built with slave labor. There's no evidence of slavery involved in the labor, but actually there is. So is there evidence of slavery? Anybody that says they're not is either just doesn't know or they're deliberately lying. We have evidence of the existence of forced labor from a piece of literature called the Words of Neferti, which were written on behalf of Amenemhat I, who is the founder of the 12th dynasty. And I'll go ahead and read the quote from the Words of Neferti here. So here it says, I shall show you the land in calamity. The weak man is the Lord of force, and he who did the greeting greeted. I shall show you the lowermost, uppermost, the man who followed after now, the man leading a generation. They will live in the necropolis. The wretched will make riches. The great will beg to exist. Only the poor will eat bread, while forced laborers are exultant. The land will have no Heliopolitan nome, the birthplace of every god. So it's not important to understand all of that quote right now, but basically the Words of Neferti is some of the propaganda literature that was justified, or that was written in order to justify Amenemhat I taking the throne. And it's talking about how bad the conditions were before this guy ascended and brought order to Egypt. So the main thing that you can notice here is he says, while forced laborers are exultant. So this is evidence that as far back as Amenemhat I, forced labor exists in Egypt. That's slavery, where you work without getting paid. So there's clear documentary evidence of this, but I've got more than this. So this one, it proves the existence of forced labor, but not that it doesn't say who that labor is, like what people group it is. But for that, we have another document called the Brooklyn Papyrus 35.1446. And this document provides us with evidence of forced labor and Hebrew slavery in Egypt. So this papyrus was found by a guy named Charles Edwin Wilbauer, and I don't think it's the only one that he found. I think he actually bought it from a market in Egypt, like a bazaar, from somebody who was selling it but didn't know what it was that he was selling. The front side of the document contains a list of people who escaped from forced labor, starting during the time of Amenemhat III, who's one of the last pharaohs of the 12th dynasty. So that's the oldest dates on this are dating back to the reign of Amenemhat III, but then there's other dates after that. He's the oldest. So over time, this list was added to by multiple officials. These are individuals who were given labor assignments, which they didn't finish, and there were directives on how to deal with these people who had run away from the forced labor. Now, the backside of this papyrus contains a list of 95 slaves belonging to a noble woman named Senebtisi, and this part of it is dated to the 13th dynasty. 45 of the names on her list are Asiatic. That means like Semitic, Middle Eastern names, not Egyptian names. And 10 of them are overtly Hebrew names. And I got a list of those names. So the Hebrew names are Menahema, Asherah, which is like the female form of Asher, Shifra, Akoba, Sekera, Dawidi Huat, Esebtu, Hayawer, and Hebrew. Now, the last name that I just read, Hebrew, it's just Hebrew. So either this person was named Hebrew from birth, or her master just called her that. You know, it seems to me like it maybe this name was put on her by the master, but maybe not. But the point is, these are Hebrew names. It's a slave list with Hebrew names. So what this indicates is that the Israelites absolutely were enslaved as late as the 13th dynasty. And here is hard proof, documentary proof of it. And also, it shows that there was a private component to slavery. These people weren't all just property of the state. Here you have a master that's a private slaveholder. So that could have been part of the reason why the Pharaoh didn't want to just let all the Israelites go. He might not have been able to let them go because a large portion of them or a significant portion of them could have been privately owned. We know that at least these ones on the list were. So I want to read a quote from the Brooklyn Museum website. What they said here is, the most important text recounts the efforts of a 13th dynasty Theban noblewoman named Senebtisi to establish legal ownership of 95 household servants whose names indicate that 45 were of Asiatic origin. The presence of so many foreigners in a single household suggests that the Asiatic population was increasing rapidly in the 13th dynasty Egypt. Now, the Asiatic Semitic population was actually growing and becoming more numerous throughout the 12th dynasty as well. The Brooklyn Museum, or at least on their website, they take the position that the accretion of Semites in Egypt during the Middle Kingdom period was a factor in its collapse, the end of the 13th dynasty, the beginning of the intermediate period. So they're not saying that these Semites are the Hyksos, but they weakened Egypt in such a way that the Hyksos were able to take over. And they actually address the presence of the name Shifra on a pull-down menu to the left, which maybe I can put a screen cap. It says, scholars assume that this is the hieroglyphic transliteration of the Hebrew name Shifra, who's also, if you guys recall, was one of the midwives that spared the Israelites when the Pharaoh had ordered them to kill the baby boys. This is one of the midwives that didn't comply. It's probably not the same person, but somebody with the same name. So this papyrus was written in hieratic, which is a cursive text of hieroglyphics. Any questions about this, guys, so far?
No.
Nope.
Does it seem reasonable? Like, I mean, this has to be the ballpark for this because it's mentioned clearly on a list.
Around what year? Around what year was this? Like BC.
So that's a good question, Stilgar. I was going to deal with that in the very last, but I'll go ahead and make mention of it a little bit now. So the thing is, the official chronology that the establishment gives for the timeline of Egypt, they give the years 1991 BC to 1802 BC for the 12th dynasty. Now, the Israelites, they left Egypt. If you go by based on the lineages that was in the Bible, they left Egypt in 1446 BC, which would put them in the 18th dynasty of Egypt, which is the New Kingdom period. The New Kingdom doesn't really work for us because there's no, the Ipuwer papyrus comes during the Middle Kingdom period, like right near the end. So it's 13th dynasty. And also there's no pyramids being built throughout the New Kingdom period. Like that's over. After the second intermediate period, there's no more of that. Actually, I think while the 13th dynasty was going on, they went back to mastabas. So the timeline, which has been reconstructed for ancient Egypt, that the official scholars do, like the atheists and such that work for the establishment, it's based on margins of error. It's based on assumptions, and it involves margins of error that go into the hundreds of years. And there's been suggestions that maybe it should be shortened by 200 to 350 years. So I'll come back to it later, but basically the official chronology probably needs to be revised based on this evidence and other things that I'm going to bring up as we go on. So that's a good question. I'll sit on that some more kind of at the end of this.
Because there's a lot of debate about that, right? About still around what the year,
Yes,
was.
there's a ton of debate. I mean, if you just go and you look up a lot of these old pharaohs, like the further you go back, it says they might have ruled a certain amount of years, like maybe 10 years according to this list, 15 years according to another list. And of course, they don't know the length of the co-regencies, which we'll come back to it. I want to go through some more information before we. So what I can do is in the end of this presentation, we can talk more about the chronology and also why some of the other suggestions that have been made for where Moses and the Exodus occurred are wrong. Because there's a few other suggestions that are out there coming even from like Christian and Jewish institutions that are suggesting other times, but they're wrong. What I want to do now is talk a little bit about the cultural characteristics of the 12th dynasty. So the 12th dynasty was founded by a guy named Amenemhat I, who I also did a video on. And he started his career as actually the vizier for Mentuhotep IV. And Mentuhotep IV was the last pharaoh of the 11th dynasty. And he had no children. I guess maybe he couldn't. He might have been completely sterile. So he didn't have a legitimate successor. And after he died, possibly murdered, we don't know. But after he died, Amenemhat I becomes the pharaoh. And he is not of royal blood. He's not part of the nobility. He got his job probably because he earned it, by way of merit. He was the vizier. But another thing about Amenemhat I, which I didn't know when I made the last video about him, is that he actually was not completely Egyptian. His mother was a Nubian. And so there's some challenges about, his claims to the throne are not very good. So what he does is he uses a mixture of propaganda and achievements to establish legitimacy for himself. And this is one of the reasons why we have more literature from the Middle Period Kingdom, is because they used the entertainment industry, such as it was, to promote themselves. So he begins the custom, pushing the notion that the pharaoh is a son of Ra, and that Ra can incarnate into another woman. Like the next legitimate pharaoh may not even necessarily be the son of the current pharaoh, because Ra can incarnate using another woman who's not at all related. He can impregnate any human woman at any time, and the proof that this guy is the son of Ra is his ability to attain the throne and hold on to it. So I don't know if I would buy that argument, but it seemed to work for them. And one of the arguments that they'll make using their literature is that the 12th dynasty is the cultural and spiritual successor to the 4th. The 4th dynasty was a very successful dynasty of the Old Kingdom period. They built some huge pyramids and other things. And according to the Amenemhat the First and the 12th dynasty pharaohs, the 5th to 11th dynasties were a period of decay and chaos, kind of like a garbage time, and that these guys are here to fix it, basically. So examples of this doctrine can be found in the tale of King Cheops' court and the words of Neferti, which I've read. And another thing that Amenemhat I does is he reinstitutes the custom of building pyramids, but of course the original technology was lost, so he's got to use different method. These pyramids are made out of weaker stuff than the Old Kingdom pyramids. They're made out of bricks, so they're not at all in the same state of preservation. Some of them just look like big mounds of dirt, including Amenemhat I's pyramid. Like if you guys saw it, you might not even think it's a pyramid. I'll include a picture of it. It looks kind of like a big pile of dirt. Okay, so another thing he does is he institutes the policy of the co-regency, which is important because the guy who's going to come after you becomes a co-regent, and you guys rule at the same time. So it's kind of like an internship. Ostensibly, both pharaohs in the co-regency have the same level of power, but realistically, obviously, the guy who's older is going to have seniority and be able to get rid of the guy that's in training if he wants to, which we'll come to that later, some more on that. But basically what this does is it creates a stable regime where you don't have wars of succession and other issues like that. So the pharaohs of the 12th dynasty, they are continuous, but they're not all related to each other by blood. Okay, so sometimes maybe the pharaoh picks somebody that he just thinks is good and has that guy training to become the next pharaoh, and then he becomes. So it does create a lot of stability, and the 12th dynasty is uninterrupted and lasts for about 200 years. All right, so now what I want to do is read some of the literature. Let me just get it here, and you guys can read the verses that I give you. So I came across, I've read a bit of 12th dynasty literature, and I noticed as I'm reading that it reminds me of different parts of the Bible. Okay, so this is from the words of Neferti, and Stilgar, I want you to be ready to read Exodus chapter 1, and New Resolve, I want you to be ready with Exodus chapter 4.
Okay.
So I'll go ahead and read this first. This is from the words of Neferti. So here it says, Asiatics have come down to Egypt. A secure stronghold is lacking. Someone else is close by, without the guards hearing. A ladder will be waited for in the night. The stronghold will be entered. The slumber in the eyes will be kept away, just as the sleeper says, I am awake. And the flock of foreign countries will drink at the river of Egypt. They will cool themselves on their banks, lacking anything to make them fearful. This land will go to and fro, the consequences unknown, and what will happen is hidden. Like the saying, see how the hearer is deaf. The mute takes the lead. I shall show you the land in catastrophe, what should not happen happening. Arms of war will be taken up, and the land will live by uproar. Okay, Stilgar, go ahead and read Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 10.
Then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies. Fight against us and leave the country. So they put slave masters till 12, you said, right?
You can read till 12. I just said till 10, but go ahead and read till 12.
Oh, sorry. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for the Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites.
All right.
Yep, sorry.
So, like I said, does it sound it sounds kind of similar, right?
Yeah.
The same kind of fear. So, New Resolve, go ahead and read Exodus 4, verses 2 through 4.
Okay. So the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? Moses said, a rod. And he said, cast it on the ground. So he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses fled from it. Then the Lord said to Moses, reach out your hand and take it by the tail. And he reached out his hand and caught it, and it became a rod in his hand.
All right. So what I'm going to read now comes from the tale of King Cheop's court, which is it was a story that is like a series of stories, or contains a series of stories within. So here's what I want to read here from the tale of King Cheop's court, because this reminded me of what you just read. Then Ubaynor said, go, bring me my documents in my chest of ebony and electrum, and I'll fashion and send a messenger. Then he modeled a wax crocodile 7 fingers long, and he read out a spell, reading it thus: as for the man who will come to wash in my pool, you shall seize the commoner in your mouth. Then he gave it to the steward and said to him, now when the commoner has gone down to my pool, as is his daily custom, you shall throw this crocodile into the water with him. The steward then went and took the wax crocodile with him. Then Ubaynor's wife sent to the steward who looked after the garden to say, have the pavilion in the garden made ready. Look, I'm coming to relax in it. Then the pavilion was made ready with every good thing. They then went, and they made holiday with the commoner. Now when it was evening, the commoner then came away, as was his daily custom. Then the steward threw the wax crocodile after him into the water. Then it became a crocodile of 7 cubits. Then it seized the commoner in its mouth. Now Ubaynor had to remain with the majesty of the dual king Nebka, the justified, for 7 days, while the commoner was in the depths of the pool, without anything to breathe there. Now when it was the 7th day, the dual king Nebka, the justified, then proceeded southwards. Then the high lector priest, Ubaynor, placed himself in the royal presence. Then Ubaynor said, look, a deed has been told to me. May your majesty proceed and see the wonder which has happened in your majesty's time, a commoner under water. Then his majesty went with Ubaynor. Then Ubaynor summoned the crocodile, saying, bring the commoner immediately. The crocodile came out with the commoner in its mouth. Then the high lector priest Ubaynor said, the commoner, release him. Then it spat him out. Then it put him down without having harmed him. And the majesty of the dual king Nebka the justified said, this is surely a fierce crocodile. Ubaynor then bent down. Then he took hold of it, and in his hand it was a wax crocodile. So, Stilgar, I want you to read Exodus chapter 7, verses 10 through 3.
Exodus 7, 10 for free, you said, right?
Yep.
Okay, 1 second. All right. 10 through 13, you mean?
Oh, yeah, my bad. 10
Yeah.
through 13.
So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron threw his staff down in front of Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a snake. Pharaoh then summoned wise men and sorcerers, and the Egyptian magicians also did the same things by their secret arts. Each one of them threw down his staff, and it became a snake. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Yet Pharaoh's heart became hard, and he would not listen to them, just as the Lord had said.
So, maybe you guys noticed what I noticed, but it says by their secret arts they did the same thing.
Yeah.
So it looks like in this story here, from the tale of King Cheop's court, we're getting a look from their perspective of the arts of the Egyptian priesthood, their secret arts. And of course, hearing this, it sounds like a fantasy, sounds like something from Disney, all right? But to the people who lived during this time period, this would have made more sense to them. They would have known what this is. I suspect some kind of mechanism, basically. But what do you guys think about that? I'm sure you noticed the similarity, right?
Yeah, I wish that I knew exactly what he was referring to, but there's a new interview. It came out 5 days ago on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast with this man who apparently he's a Christian apologist, and his name is Wesley Huff. And in 5 days, it already has 3.8 million views. I saw a clip from this interview because it's so long, where the man Wesley Huff said something like, I can't remember what writing he referenced, but I thought of this when you said what you said, because he was talking about how it was known that the Egyptians, like it was known very well back then that the Egyptians did magic. And he may have been talking about that in relation to like the miracles that Christ was doing, and how, people in those days, they it wasn't all too uncommon for people to it wasn't all too uncommon for people to believe in otherworldly things. And an example of that was how people knew that they did magic in Egypt. I wish if anybody's interested, that interview is 3 hours long, and he's interviewing a Christian man. So I'm not sure where he got it from, but it sounded really, really interesting.
I watched the whole thing as well.
Oh, you did? Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's a long video. But he was talking somewhere along those lines. But yeah, he's a Christian apologetic, right? So he defends the Bible and how it's a historic book and how it's not just a bunch of stories.
Wow.
So yeah, it's very, very, and then he does talk about how back in the day, like referring to a magician would be normal to people. That's something people would be totally would take for granted. So it wouldn't be like a Disney kind of thing to them. That would be perfectly within the realm of possibilities.
Yeah, and I guess for anyone else listening as well, I've never personally looked too deep into this myself, but I think it's in the New Testament. Maybe St. Paul references Jannes and Jambres, like the names of these two magicians that were in the time of Moses, maybe that Moses interacted with. It's sort of like the kind of the Enoch reference in Jude, where he's referencing something that we don't see in a typical Bible. And it's like, well, where did those two names come from? Jannes and Jambres. And from the research that I did, it was a long time ago. Apparently there was some writings that at least used to be available that talked about that those were two famous magicians in Egypt. Do you guys know anything about that?
Yeah, I've heard those names. I don't remember where exactly it's found, but I'll put something in the slideshow. I'll look it up and put something.
Okay.
But one thing that everybody should keep in mind about the Middle Kingdom period of Egypt is there is no separation between religion, state, and science. It's all blurred together. So like the chief architect of Egypt is also the high priest of Ptah. That's one of his titles. And like we talked about that in the older video about Imhotep. So at least, going back into the Old Kingdom period, it looks like this blurring was kind of already there. So there's three ways of looking at it. One is to say, okay, they had magic. Another is to say, well, maybe of course, the Bible mentions that they duplicated it by their arts, by their crafts. So then arts, it doesn't have to be magic. It could also be technology that they're doing. Like where it talks about, he gets his, he says, go and bring me my documents in my chest of ebony and electrum. So he fashions the crocodile with his hands, right? And then he gives it a command. Of course, today we have machines and we give them commands with programming. So maybe at some point in time, I'll do a video on the technology of Egypt during the Old Kingdom period, but that's going to require a ton of research. So,
good.
by extension, the Middle Kingdom period. But I'll get to that whenever I get to it. But just reading this stuff, you can see that okay, this looks like the setting of Exodus, right?
Yeah.
This whole thing. So now, one last thing I want to do is, since we're here to talk about Moses, I'd like to at least get the first part kind of him before we close it off. So I want one of you guys, I think Resolve, you can do this. Read
Okay.
Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 10.
Okay. 1 through 10?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And a man of the house of Levi went and took as wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, dabbed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed him, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, because I drew him out of the water.
All right. So Josephus also talks about this, and he gives some more information. And the name he gives a name for the daughter of the Pharaoh, but not for the Pharaoh. And the name he gives is Thermuthis, which I haven't found in any of the Egyptian records, but that's okay, because I still believe I've figured out who this person is. So I'm going to read a little bit from Josephus here. Thermuthis, therefore, perceiving him to be so remarkable a child, adopted him for her son, having no children of her own. And when one time had carried Moses to her father, she showed him to him, and said she thought to make him her successor. If it should please God, she should have no legitimate child of her own. And to him, I have brought up a child who is of a divine form and of a generous mind, and as I have received him from the bounty of the river in, I thought proper to adopt him my son, and the heir of my kingdom. So the idea of receiving him from the bounty of the river, that's important. So remember that, guys. And she had said this, she put the infant into her father's hands, so he took him and hugged him to his breast, and on his daughter's account, in a pleasant way, put his diadem upon his head. But Moses threw it down to the ground, and in a puerile mood he wreathed it round and trod upon his feet, which seemed to bring along with evil presage concerning the kingdom of Egypt. But when the sacred scribe saw this, he was the person who foretold that his nativity would the dominion of that kingdom low. he made a violent attempt to kill him and cried out in a frightful manner. And crying out in a frightful manner, he said, "This, O king, this child is he of whom God foretold that if we kill him, we shall be in no danger. He himself affords an attestation to the prediction of the same thing, by his trampling upon thy government and treading upon thy diadem. Take him therefore out of the way, and deliver the Egyptians from the fear they are in about him, and deprive the Hebrews of the hope they have of being encouraged by him." But Thermuthis prevented him and snatched the child away, and the king was not hasty to slay him. God himself, whose providence protected Moses, inclining the king to spare him. He was therefore educated with great care. So the Hebrews depended on him and were of good hopes. Great things would be done by him. But the Egyptians were suspicious of what would follow such his education. Yet because if Moses had been slain, there was no one, either akin or adopted, that had any oracle on his side for pretending to the crown of Egypt, and likely to be of greater advantage to them, they abstained from killing him. The most important takeaways of this, that, assuming we can trust Josephus, which I think we can right here, is we're looking for a pharaoh with no male heir and a princess that has no children at all. Okay. Now, the next section after this that Josephus talks about is when Moses is an adult. And this part is not in the Bible, but and I won't read the whole thing here. But basically, according to Josephus, Moses had his first experience with power, or his first experience with power. His first test is repelling an invasion by the Nubians. So when Moses is an adult, the Nubians, which in the Old Testament are referred to as Cushites, and Josephus, the word he uses is actually Ethiopians, but it shouldn't be confused with the country Ethiopia today. That's a reference to the Nubians. They attack Egypt. Originally, they came in just to have like a raid and steal a few things and go back. But the Egyptians, they chase them, and they end up getting in a fight with the Nubians and losing. So then the Nubians essentially just start ransacking Egypt, running wild and loose. And in desperation, and after consulting their oracles, the Pharaoh decides to use Moses to drive out the Nubians. And what Moses does is kind of novel, because he doesn't use the river to get to them. He has his army walk around on land through an area that's infested with snakes. And to keep the snakes away, they managed to get ibises to go with them along the way to kind of eat the snakes or drive them off. But at any rate, the point is they go over land and they come at the Nubians by surprise and they defeat them. They chase them all the way back to their homeland as far south as Meroe, at which they retreat inside of. And while the Egyptians are there attacking the city, there's a princess whose name is Tharbis, according to Josephus, and she sees Moses and basically falls in love with him at first sight and proposes marriage to him. And Moses agrees to marry her on the condition that she surrenders the city to him. So they end this war with marriage. And let's see, I'll just read what Josephus says is, he thereupon accepted the offer on condition she would procure the delivering up of the city, and gave her the assurance of an oath to take her to his wife, and that when he had once taken possession of the city, he would not break his oath to her. No sooner was the agreement made, but it took effect immediately. And when Moses had cut off the Ethiopians, that's Nubians actually, he gave thanks to God and consummated his marriage and led the Egyptians back to their own land. So, of course, this whole account is not mentioned in the Bible, but it is mentioned elsewhere that Moses, one of his wives, is a Cushite, and his brother and sister object to that. I don't know if it's this woman here or if it's somebody he married later after Zipporah got old and died.
It gets me thinking because I had actually I think last night I watched an interview with Mel Gibson on Fox News where he was talking about how his house actually got burned down like to the ground along with everyone else's, and he said he even had at least one book from like the 1500s, maybe it was the Bible, in his house that he lost from the fire. And when I heard, or because of the fire, and when I heard that, it got me thinking about, was it the Library of Alexandria? Like many books, like throughout so much of history, we've lost. And it makes me think, as you're saying this, what books may have Josephus had, or this person had, or that person had that were credible, and trustworthy, that they were referencing that we don't even have anymore, potentially anyway.
Right. And that's a good point. And actually, I haven't read I haven't even read half of the first volume of the Antiquities of the Jews. But in what I've read so far, like Josephus, he references other historians and authors from different cultures and religions to back up what he's saying. I think this stuff that he's talking about with Moses comes from older Jewish traditions. Of course, we also know that a lot of the database that the Israelites had was lost because you read in like Samuel and Kings, it talks about, for more information on so-and-so, see, is it not recorded in the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? And of course, we don't have the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah anymore. But yeah, and of course, there is good evidence for the reliability of Josephus. I don't think he's perfect. But what he says, he actually leaves out, when he talks about why Moses left Egypt, he leaves out the murder. But one thing he says that is, after Moses did this, the Egyptians were terrified of him. He says, now the Egyptians, after they had been preserved by Moses, entertained a hatred to him and were very eager in compassing their designs against him, as suspecting that he would take occasion from his good success to raise a sedition and bring innovations into Egypt, and told the king he ought to be slain. Of course, he leaves out the part about the murder, but in my research, I found that it looks like Josephus is right about this, that they were a bit nervous about Moses. And the whole idea, like if Moses was set to be the heir, which according to Josephus he was, the whole propaganda from the 12th dynasty was that the king is legitimate even if he's not a true Egyptian, because Ra can incarnate into the womb of any woman. Now, if the Egyptians thought that a foreign god was incarnating into the throne, that might have really terrified them, right? Because this is a pagan and polytheistic culture. And actually, another thing about the Egyptians during the 12th dynasty is the world outside of Egypt, they considered to be the domain of Set, which is like the evil god in their mythology, like the closest thing they have to Satan. So, Stilgar, I would like you to, and here we're going to discuss the reliability of Josephus and this account of Moses here. I'd like you to read Acts chapter 7, verses 20 through 29.
Okay. At that time, Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared for by his family. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. The next day, Moses came upon 2 Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons.
All right. So it seems like from this, the key takeaway here, or one of them, is where it says Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. So would you say leading an army and defeating the Nubians is mighty in words and deeds? At least in deeds, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it looks like this could be a reference to that, even though the story didn't make it into the Bible. It's kind of showing that we can trust Josephus to some extent. Now, regarding the account of the war with the Nubians led by Moses, Irenaeus, one of the early church fathers, believed that the account given by Josephus was true and accurate. And what he says is, Josephus said that when Moses was nourished in the palace, he was appointed general of the army against the Ethiopians and conquered them. When he married that king's daughter, because of her affection for him, she delivered the city up to him. So Irenaeus thought that Josephus was legitimate. So I think this gives it some additional weight. Now, what I believe happened, and I'm going to give my evidence for it, is that because of this action, Moses was appointed to the co-regency. And as it happens, we do have a name and a face for him. And this is also part of what caused the Egyptians to be afraid, because even though he did a good job, he still wasn't really one of their people. And the fact that he knew he was an Israelite and the Israelites were mostly enslaved, that's kind of a dangerous situation. And then, getting back to the whole idea of a God incarnating into a baby, that could be, if you're like a pagan polytheist and you believe in lots of gods and you believe that the evil God is in charge of foreigners, the idea that one of those foreigners might become the next pharaoh could be pretty scary, even if you don't say or do anything controversial. So that's probably what this fear is, and the desire to have him removed, where it's coming from, that Josephus mentioned. So, as for the identity of Moses, we are looking for a pharaoh who had no male heirs, with a daughter who had no children at all. And we know that Moses lived in Egypt for 40 years before he ran away. So we need a pharaoh who ruled, not just lived, but who ruled for over 40 years. Okay, and it turns out that I found all this, but I'm going to go ahead and break it here, and then in the next video we'll discuss the names and identities and everything. So if you guys are interested to know the rest of this, do come back for part 2. Before I close it off, do you guys have any comments, questions about what we covered so far?
Yeah. Is it okay if I go? Can I say something? Or?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So, man, I mean, I really wanted to just mention this. I mean, this deserves, like, it could be talked about for so long, but if anyone listening doesn't know, Dr. Jordan Peterson has a series out. I think it might be either 12 to 16, around 16 maybe, episodes that are around over an hour long on the book of Exodus. And he and the scholars around him at this, maybe you could call it a round table, they just go verse by verse and they break it down, and Jordan Peterson's way, and then the other people, and they just give commentary, and they contemplate and they get deep on the book of Exodus, which obviously includes the life of Moses. I think it's really worth listening to.
Okay.
And also too, there's a really nice, I guess you could call it a documentary. It's not acting, but there's a film or a movie on, I think it's pretty old, but I saw it on YouTube in the past, and it's called Mysteries of the Nile. And this group of people they go on like they document their travels on like either kayaking or water rafting, whatever it would be called, and they just travel through, like, you know, the title speaks for itself, the mysteries of the Nile. They go to Nubia. I think they even go to, he pronounced it Meroe. You had pronounced it earlier Meroe, but they, in the video, they pronounced it Meroe. But if you want to see real footage of Egypt and people people traveling by, I think maybe kayak or whatever they're on the Nile, Mysteries of the Nile is on YouTube. That's a good, you know, and could kind of put the, you know, put it like a geographical visual to what's been talked about in this video, you know, in case you've never seen it.
Yeah, the Nubians were a historical enemy for Egypt. They did trade with them and they did have peaceful relations, but they also frequently had wars and lots of raids, and also fighting over territory that's kind of between them, that's kind of contested.
Yeah.
And there's still Nubians today. Of course, most of them, they've converted to Islam, but they did a better job retaining their original languages than the Egyptians did. Of course, the ethnic Nubians that are in Sudan today, they're under pressure to kind of Arabize and speak that language. But of course, that's, you know, that's another matter. Of course, what's left of the Egyptian population today is the Coptic population of Egypt, which still uses the last stage of the Egyptian language in their liturgy, which I know we've all seen, all three of us. Yeah, I do believe with 85% certainty I've found Moses and the Pharaoh who drowned babies, as well as the woman who took them out of the water. And so that will be the topic of the next one. I'm just breaking it here because it's a natural break point, and I don't want this to be too big of a video, or there might be some issues uploading it. But when we come back, we'll pick up right where we left off with this one. So you got anything, Stilgar, or should we close it?
Yeah, no, I was going to ask you what got you into this this topic, but maybe you want to keep that for the next video. Like, how did you find out about this the real time period?
Yeah.
So I'll tell you, I'll halfway answer that question right now. So when I was a kid, about maybe 8 or 7, I got this thing called a picture Bible, which was like a kind of graphic novel version of the Bible, although it doesn't nearly have everything that was in the Bible. You know, it's kind of abridged. But the whole life of Moses always fascinated me, like all the miracles that were done through him, and also how he went from being, you know, from being this wealthy, powerful guy, you know, the possibly the heir to the throne, to being a shepherd in the desert, and then it's kind of like a riches to rags story. And I'm also was wondering, okay, well, what all did he do while he was in Egypt? And that always was something I wanted to know. So I have been it's just been kind of like on my mind since I was a little kid. And I finally kind of found, I came aware of the Ipuwer papyrus about 10 years ago or 12 years ago. I was in my 20s. And that allowed me to kind of ballpark all of this. And then, you know, so for the words of Nefertiti and the tale of King Cheops' court, they're part of a collection of books that I got, a collection of Middle Kingdom period Egyptian writings. So if anybody's interested, the book is called The Tale of Sinuhe and Other Ancient Egyptian Poems. And you have a picture of this pharaoh on the front. It's kind of a green bust, and it contains, the tale of King Cheops' court, the words of Nefertiti, the wisdom of Amenemhat, and the dialogue of the Ipuwer papyrus. But here, for this translation I got in my book, it's called The Dialogue of Ipuwer and the Lord of All. So and there's other stuff in here too, like the actual tale of Sinuhe. And I got this book because I wanted to have a hard copy of the Tale of Sinuhe, and I was pleasantly surprised to find all these other, that a full translation of the Ipuwer text was here, and all these other stories. And as I'm reading through these stories, I'm like, man, this sounds like what's in the Bible.
Wow.
So, yeah. But that's kind of, I know that's kind of a roundabout thing, but I've always been interested in Moses. And you think about it, his life was divided up into thirds: 40 years in Egypt, 40 years tending cattle in the desert, and 40 years leading the Israelites and performing miracles with them. And when I was a kid, I used to think, okay, probably the easiest time of his life was in the palace. But based on my research and everything else I've discovered since then, the way it's looking right now is the best time of his, I should say the easiest time of his life was when he's in the desert tending sheep. That's when he had like the slowest paced life and the least amount of responsibilities. So if you think about it, his retirement actually comes in the middle of his life. And it's kind of sandwiched by 40 years of hard work, a bit of vacation, and then another 40 years of hard work. But at least, because he goes back to Egypt when he's 80, at least when he's going back to Egypt, when God speaks to him, he gets to speak to God, which is something that, we don't really get to see stuff like this today. So it was a great privilege, even though it was pretty stressful dealing with the Israelites and their complaining and rebellion. So,
well, and if any parents listening, anyone listening with kids, Ivor read that when he was 7 or 8, and it stuck out to him, and here he is all this time later with the desire to bring things around full circle and do this talk on it. So never say never. You never know. Don't underestimate what you let your kids read when it comes to the Bible. You may be planting a seed in them to maybe your children will end up doing a Bible study on something that they read when they were a kid, but you showed it to them. So don't underestimate the Bible for your kids. So
I read the Bible when I was a kid, and I read the picture Bible, which is an illustrated version. I still have my old picture Bible. It's pretty tore up right now, but I'll put some pictures of that in the slideshow, including the initial sequence that got my gears turning. And the Tale of Sinuhe I read when I was in college in my 20s. And part of it kind of reminded me of The Matrix, because you have, like, in the main character Sinuhe, there's a scene where he's fighting with a Canaanite, and he actually dodges the Canaanite's arrows, kind of like Neo dodging the bullets. And when I read this, it was around when the first Matrix movie came out, and I was like, dude, I wonder if they stole the idea of him dodging bullets from the Tale of Sinuhe, where Sinuhe's dodging arrows. But Sinuhe is the Tale of Sinuhe is another story which comes from the beginning of the 12th Dynasty, following the death of Amenemhat I. Amenemhat I was murdered. He was assassinated. And Sinuhe is like, may or may not have been a real person. I think probably not. But it became like a popular story during the Middle Kingdom period. And I believe that the majority of the oldest surviving texts of the Tale of Sinuhe are dated to the late 12th dynasty, which would have been around when Moses was born. And in the story, like Sinuhe, he hears that Amenemhat I has been assassinated, and he freaks out because, in the ancient world, if the king's assassinated, sometimes it doesn't just stop there. The whole administration is purged. So this guy runs. He runs, like, he sneaks out of Egypt by way of back roads, and he gets to Canaan, and he almost passes out from thirst. He's about to die, and then he's saved by some Canaanites. And the leader of that tribe of Canaanites, his name is, I think, Amenemhat, and he offers him, like, hey, you'll like to stay with me because there's Egyptians in my country, so you'll be able to hear your native language. and he offers him his daughter in marriage. So it kind of sounds like the narrative that Moses followed when he ran out of Egypt. And I suspect strongly, I give it a 99.9999999% probability that Moses read the tale of Sinuhe, and that's what gave him the idea to run in that direction. And he was a little bit smarter because he stopped by a well. He didn't just keep running until he passed out in the desert and had to be picked up. But at any rate, guys, I think we'll close it off, and next time we'll talk about names and faces of these people and what Moses did while he was in Egypt.
Great.
Yep. Alrighty, guys. See you guys in the next one.
Deus homo factus est natura mirante, mundus renovatus est a Christo regnante. Gaudete, Christus est natus, ex Maria Virgine gaudete.